Hi there, I'm Tim Gray of Gray Learning, and thank you for joining me for this presentation as part of the Lightroom Virtual Summit, where we're going to be talking about lens and perspective corrections. Every photo you capture, of course, involves the use of a lens, and each lens has unique behavior, and part of that relates to a degree of distortion and other issues. And so today I'm going to show you how to correct those issues, as well as issues related to perspective, which primarily relate to your specific position relative to a subject. If you're down low or up high or over to one side, that can effectively alter the perspective of the scene, and we have a variety of ways that we can correct for perspective issues in Lightroom Classic. So let's take a look at lens correction and perspective correction in Lightroom Classic. We'll start off with profile-based lens corrections, which, as the name implies, involve using a profile that describes the specific behavior of the lens that was used to capture the photo in order to compensate for that behavior. And specifically, we're compensating for behavior related to distortion as well as vignetting. If you take a look at this photo, it might initially seem that there's no problem with distortion. Everything seems to be reasonably well aligned. Nothing looks oddly out of sorts, in other words, but we'll see that actually a profile-based lens correction can improve the image, even when it doesn't seem like there's a distortion issue to begin with. So let's take a look in the lens correction section. So in the develop module over on the right panel here in Lightroom Classic, I'll scroll down and find the lens corrections section. And here we have two tabs. There's the profile tab as well as the manual tab. And we're going to start off here on the profile tab where we can select a profile to compensate for the behavior of the lens here. Keep in mind that not every lens is supported with a profile. And so in order to actually apply this adjustment, you need to make sure that the lens is supported with a profile, but many manufacturers and many specific lenses are covered with profiles in Lightroom Classic. So the first step is to turn on the Enable Profile Corrections checkbox. That is the lens profile corrections for the image. So I'll turn on that checkbox, and you can see immediately there's actually an improvement in the image even when it didn't seem like the image was necessarily problematic. So I'm going to toggle that checkbox off and on, and you'll notice that we have a variation in terms of what's referred to as barrel versus pincushion distortion. And so just to emphasize that, I'm going to switch to the manual option and I'll adjust the distortion slider. We'll take a closer look at these adjustments in a moment, but you can see here the barrel distortion where the image is bulged out versus pincushion distortion. And so that is the overall concept of what we're correcting for in terms of distortion with the lens. This is going to be most prominent with wide-angle lenses, but it can be an issue for just about any lens. So I'll reset that distortion and come back to profile. And again, turning that option on and then off, we see that little bit of a correction in terms of that bulging, that barrel versus pincushion distortion. But also take a look at the edges, especially the corners of the image. And in this case, it's more prominent in the bottom corners of the image. As I turn off the checkbox for the profile corrections and then turn it back on again, notice that the corners are going from being a little bit dark to brighter. And this is compensating for vignetting. And this also is primarily going to be an issue, or a more significant issue in any event, with wide-angle lenses where there's a degree of light fall-off out toward the edges. And that results in a little bit darker view at those edges, that vignetting, which is going to be most prominent typically in the corners. It will vary a little bit with the image itself, of course, in terms of how easy it is to effectively see that lightening or darkening, the darkening of the vignette versus the lightening of the correction. In the sky here, for example, it's not quite as obvious. There's certainly a change there, but it sort of stands out a little better, especially I think in the bottom left corner of this image. But even when it's not especially prominent, it can be a bit of an issue, so it's a good idea to correct for that. Of course, you might want to actually apply a vignette to your image. Keep in mind that vignetting, and I'll address this a little bit later, creative vignetting should be applied in a separate way. Right now we're just correcting for the vignetting. We'll use a different approach to adding a creative vignette. So more on that shortly. But another issue that I want to address here is that sometimes you might turn on the checkbox and the correction is not applied automatically. There's no adjustment at all. And that typically just means that the profile was not established accurately. It wasn't established correctly. It could also, of course, mean that the lens that was used to capture the image is not actually supported by Lightroom Classic. But if you're finding that the correction is not applied when you turn on the Enable Profile Corrections checkbox, the first thing to do is to click the Setup pop-up and choose the Auto option. And what auto means is that the metadata for the image should be evaluated to see which lens was used, and then the appropriate profile should be selected. Sometimes even that won't solve the issue, in which case you can select the manufacturer of the lens that was used from the pop-up list. Usually that will resolve the issue, but if not, you can select the specific lens from that manufacturer from the second pop-up. And finally, you could make sure that the correct profile for the selected lens has been selected. And so as long as the lens is supported and the appropriate profile for that lens is selected from this pop-up, then you'll be able to have that correction applied. And again, toggling that checkbox, you can see that it can actually have a relatively significant impact on the image. It's one of those things that if you don't apply the adjustment, you might not miss it, but once you apply it, I think you'll find that it can be very helpful for the overall image, making that image look that much better. And again, as we'll see later, we can also add back a vignette that is specific for how we've cropped the image a little bit later. And then we do have some opportunity to fine-tune the adjustments that were applied with that profile. So again, the profile is based on the specific behavior of the lens. The lens behavior essentially was measured and calculated in a profile created to compensate, but that doesn't always mean that you're going to be perfectly happy with that compensation. So I'll switch to a different image here, and we can apply that same adjustment. So again, in the Lens Corrections section, on that Profile tab on the right panel here in the Develop module, I'll turn on the Enable Profile Corrections checkbox, and here we see a rather dramatic change in terms of the vignetting. In this case, the image was captured with a 10mm lens. It's on a cropped sensor, so it's the equivalent of a 16mm lens on a full-frame camera. And that's a rather wide view, and it also means that there's going to be an increased risk of light fall-off, which means vignetting around the edges. And also with a wide-angle lens, we're going to tend to see a little bit more of that distortion, and we certainly can see the evidence of that as I toggle that checkbox off and on. And so in this case, the profile was selected accurately, and so we don't need to worry about that. But now I want to take a look at the option to essentially fine-tune the adjustment that was applied. And so we have two controls in the Amount section here at the bottom of the Profile tab, and those are the distortion and vignetting sliders. So as we've already seen, distortion is applying that compensation for barrel versus pincushion distortion, and vignetting, of course, is compensating for vignetting or that light fall-off around the edges of the image. But if you're not totally happy with the profile-based correction, we can fine-tune just a little bit using these two controllers. So we'll start off with distortion. Note as I hover my mouse or as I adjust the slider for distortion, I get a grid over the image. And in a way, you can think of distortion correction as trying to get straight lines to be straight again. So with barrel distortion, for example, the lines might be bowed out. With pincushion distortion, they might be pinched inward, they might be curving in the opposite direction. And we generally want straight lines to be straight or vertical lines to be vertical. And so the grid can help us to evaluate the result effectively. So I'll go ahead and drag the slider over toward the right and then back to the left. And notice we're introducing essentially pincushion versus barrel distortion just a little bit, and hopefully finding just the right point for that adjustment, referencing the grid lines. Of course, in this case, we have an old abandoned homestead, and so the lines aren't exactly straight or parallel within the scene here, within our key subject. But the point is that we can compensate for the correction that was applied and decide what we feel looks the most accurate. So I think right about there actually looks a little bit better for this image. And then the vignetting as well. And so I can drag over toward the right to brighten those edges with an emphasis on the corners just a little bit more, or I can drag to the left in order to darken. And again, keep in mind, this is not where we want to apply creative vignetting. That will come a little bit later, but this is really just to compensate. If there was especially strong vignetting in the image, we might want to drag the slider over to the right to compensate for that, Or if we don't want to get rid of all of the vignetting, or if the brightening effect was a little bit too much, we can drag to the left. So in this case, actually, I feel like there was more vignetting in this image. We need a little bit stronger adjustment, so I'll drag that slider over toward the right. And keep in mind, with the overall sections, with the exception of the basic section on the right panel here, we can toggle the switch to the left of the heading in order to turn off that category of adjustments and then turn it back on. And so that gives us a good overview of the changes. And here we have much more even lighting in the image overall, thanks to that vignette correction, and an image that is now compensating for, the effect is compensating for that little bit of barrel distortion that we had in the image. So that looks to be a significant improvement at this stage. Now, you may have noticed, of course, that I was looking at the Enable Profile Corrections checkbox, and we ignored, at least for the moment, the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox. And that certainly is an option that I generally recommend taking advantage of. So let's take a look at that issue specifically. I'll switch to another image here. And chromatic aberrations are essentially a halo, typically of a relatively strong color, and it will appear most commonly around the edges of backlit subjects. And it is an issue that is most common with wide-angle lenses in general, and with cheaper lenses. Lenses, for example, that might have plastic elements or just not the best optics, because a chromatic aberration effectively is caused, at least in part, when different wavelengths of light, or you could think of it as different colors of light, are in focus versus not in focus. So if most of the light were in focus, but the magenta light was out of focus, then we might expect to see some chromatic aberrations. You can see the sort of magenta halo here on the right side of the tower of the bridge. There's a bit of a cyan halo over on the left side. That is chromatic aberration. Fortunately, Lightroom Classic includes some very nice controls for correcting for that chromatic aberration. Starting off with, obviously, that checkbox that we noted a little moment ago. And so first off, I can turn on that checkbox to apply what is effectively automatic chromatic aberration correction. And in my experience, about half the time, if you see chromatic aberrations in the image, simply turning on this checkbox will be all you need. And the other half of the time, we need a little bit more help. So I'm going to turn on the checkbox here, and we'll see actually a rather significant improvement. I'll zoom in a little closer though, and you'll see that there's still a little bit of evidence of that chromatic aberration. So this would be an image where the chromatic aberration was especially strong, and so we're not getting a complete correction. Fortunately though, we can compensate for that. So I generally recommend that you have the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox turned on for just about any image. In my experience, it's never been something that causes a problem. If anything, it helps to solve a problem. And so generally, I leave that checkbox turned on for all images, and when there's chromatic aberration, it usually does a good job. But if it doesn't solve the issue correctly, we can switch to the Manual tab on the Lens Correction section of the right panel here. So I'll click Manual, and then you can see that down below I have the defringe controls. Now I can actually use the eyedropper to click in the color that represents the chromatic aberration, that represents the problem, but I generally prefer to simply go directly to the sliders here. So we'll start off with the purple controls, and so we have an amount slider for purple and then a purple hue. In other words, defining the color range that we're going to consider to be purple. So let's start off by increasing the amount. At a value of 0, there's no additional correction being applied. So I'll increase the value for amount here, and we'll see that eventually that purple starts to disappear. But you might notice I'm also starting to get this sort of gray fringing now. I'll increase the value even more, and we get a stronger effect. So now we've just about gotten rid of all of that magenta or purple fringing, but we've introduced a new problem here. And in this case, really the biggest issue, I think, is that we're expanding our correction out into the sky. In other words, the cyan color values here. And so if we take a look at the purple hue sliders, there's actually 2 slider handles there, and I can define the range. So I can expand the range out into more cyan and more orange. That obviously creates a more significant problem in this case, where we're removing the quote-unquote color fringing that's actually sky color. But I can then, of course, also contract that range, reduce the range. So especially in this case, wanting to cut off those cyans. And so as I drag that slider over toward the right, we'll start to see that we're narrowing that range a little bit and then just trying to fine tune. So you'll notice that I've gotten rid of most of the gray in that blue sky area, the cyans in this case, but I also still have a little bit of magenta fringing. So I need to try to fine tune and find just the right balance for that overall control, and also the more orange end of the range here. If I go too far, once again, the oranges in the tower there start to turn gray. So trying to find just the right balance for those settings so that I'm minimizing the appearance of any fringing there while not creating new problems in terms of that gray. And once I've defined a better range, then of course I could reduce the amount. I don't need to use more of an amount than is necessary. So with a well-defined range for the color values, the hue, I can then fine-tune, reduce the value for amount, and then increase it just enough to get rid of that actual magenta or purple color fringing. And then similarly, I'll go over to the other side of the bridge tower here. We've got still a little bit of that cyan, and so that represents our green hue. And in this case specifically, the cyan is a bit of an issue, and that's going to be a challenge because, of course, we have the cyan sky plus a little bit of a cyan color fringing. To start off, I need to increase the amount. So for the green hue, we'll increase the value for amount, and I'll apply an exaggerated adjustment here, just so it'll become a bit more obvious once we redefine the range of colors. And then I could expand back toward the yellows and the oranges. You'll start to see, especially up here toward the top of the image, some of the yellow shifting to more gray values. So obviously we don't want to extend out that far. I'll pull that back in, and right about there looks okay. And then the right slider, we want to push out into the cyans, but again, needing to be very, very careful because as we push too far, we're getting out into the sky. So I'll need to reduce that value, and to right about there looks to be a good range for the colors. And once again, I can then reduce the amount to tone that adjustment down a little bit so that it's not so dramatic. And so that gives us the ability then to define both the ranges of colors and the strength of that chromatic aberration correction so that we're able to mitigate that effect in the image. And once again, I'll turn off that lens correction section. Obviously, there's a bit of distortion correction being applied as well, so the image is shifting a little bit based on that correction. But pay in particular attention to the color fringing and notice how it effectively disappears as I turn that adjustment back on. So whenever you have chromatic aberrations, which obviously, as you've seen here, you might need to zoom in a little bit to be able to see that chromatic aberration effectively, but with careful adjustment, especially of the hue controls to find just the right color range, and then of course the amount to determine the strength of the adjustment, you can compensate for that chromatic aberration. One other thing that I recommend being careful of when you're correcting for chromatic aberrations in an image is to make sure that you're not focusing exclusively on one area of the image. In this case, for example, I focused all of my attention on the left tower of the bridge in correcting for the chromatic aberration. And the result looks very good, of course, but it's possible that by applying corrections to this side of the image, that I might have actually introduced chromatic aberrations or exaggerated them in any event in another area of the photo, or I might have created some of that gray artifacting that we saw earlier in other areas of the image. So this area of the photo looks perfectly fine, but I want to check other areas of the image as well. And that includes being careful to check different areas because the chromatic aberrations are related to the lens. And so we might see more chromatic aberrations out toward the edges versus the center. And so we'll want to check. So for example, I'll click into the center of the image and click and drag to pan around within the central area. Everything looks to be good in that respect. And I'll take a look over toward the right side as well. And things look good here in addition. If I pan upward a little bit, I'm seeing just a little bit of cyan there, so I might see if I can increase the range just a little bit. In fact, let me zoom in just a little bit closer there, and not too bad, but a little bit of cyan. I'll try to expand the range, and actually that looks to be helping nicely increase the amount just a little bit, and then I'll zoom out and then zoom in on the other side where I had originally been working and make sure that everything looks okay, especially as it relates to the cyan. And you can see that I've created a little bit of a problem there, so I might need to pull back that value for the hue, in this case, reduce that range just a little bit, tone things down. And so again, a lot of that just comes down to compromise in terms of how we're adjusting, how we're balancing those different adjustments based on reviewing different areas of the image. And keeping in mind, the chromatic aberration effect is relatively small, and so chances are, even though I'm zooming in and being really critical and trying to find the perfect settings, if there's just a tiny bit of fringing, that's probably not going to be a major problem for the image. So again, being sure to evaluate different areas of the photo as you're picking and choosing between the various settings that you want to apply. Another issue that you might run into is vignetting. So we talked about vignetting in the context of lens corrections, but as I mentioned, you don't want to use that for the application of a creative effect. So here I'll switch back to the profile-based corrections, and I'll turn off the profile corrections and turn that back on again. And we might actually want to increase the correction for the vignetting in this case. Didn't seem to be quite strong enough. That looks to be a bit better. So now we've compensated for the vignetting, but we can also apply creative vignetting. But again, we don't want to do that here in lens corrections, because then if we crop the image, we're going to be cropping the vignette. And so instead, we want to come down to the effects section on the right panel, and we'll start off with the amount. So in the post-crop vignetting, the amount slider determines, are we brightening the outer edges or darkening the outer edges? And so I'll apply an exaggerated darkening. We can adjust the midpoint to pull the vignette closer into the center of the image or keep it way out toward the edges. I'm going to pull it in just a little bit to illustrate another issue here. We can determine how round versus more rectangular we want that vignette effect to be. Again, I'm keeping an exaggerated effect so I can show you one other control here. We can feather, how much blending do we want for that vignetting, but then we come to the highlights slider. Now, we also have a style setting, and now the highlights control is only available if we're using the highlight priority or the color priority option. If you use paint overlay, that won't be available, but I find the paint overlay option actually creates kind of a dingy look in the image, so it's not one that I generally recommend. Usually I prefer highlight priority, but you can switch between these two to see which option works best for the specific image. And with one of those options selected, we can control the highlights, and here we can choose essentially to darken or brighten the brightest highlights. I'll darken, and I'm going to pull the vignette in a little bit more and reduce that feathering so you can get a better sense of the adjustment. And the idea is that vignetting is a light fall off, but if we have a very bright light near the edge of the frame, the sun in this case, that bright light is going to overpower that control. And so we can choose whether or not we want the sun in this case to overpower. So with a low setting, the sun will be diminished a little bit. With a higher setting, it will not be diminished. So obviously this is a wildly exaggerated effect. In this case, I'll tone that down a little bit. Well, actually, I'll leave it a bit exaggerated so that you can get a better sense here. In fact, let's make it even more exaggerated just for purposes of illustrating this next issue. So this is a post-crop vignetting. So I mentioned if you use the lens corrections for vignetting to apply a creative effect and then crop the image, you're going to be cropping out part of that vignetting. Here, because I've used the post-crop vignetting, the crop will maintain. So the vignette essentially follows that crop. So again, obviously this is not the most interesting creative effect in terms of a vignette, but just to illustrate the concept for that post-crop vignetting, that this is the place that you want to apply that creative vignetting versus compensating for the vignetting caused by the lens, for example. So I'll go ahead and click Done just to apply that crop, even though this is not exactly the effect I want for this image, but we'll move on to another image to take a look at some of the perspective corrections. So far we've primarily been looking at corrections based on lens behavior. Now we're going to shift to perspective corrections, which essentially relates to the position of the camera relative to the subject. So if you're directly head on to the subject, then generally straight lines will appear more or less straight. If you're down low, buildings might, for example, seem to be leaning away from you a little bit in the photo. If you're up high, the buildings might seem to be leaning closer to you. If you're off to one side or the other, things might not line up just the way you'd like. And we can compensate for those types of perspective issues with some transform controls. So over on the right panel here in the Develop module, I'll choose Transform, and we're going to start off with the Transform sliders to get a sense of what these various sliders do. And it's important to keep in mind that we're going to look at some other sort of more automatic adjustments shortly. These transform adjustments can still be applied after those automatic adjustments. But for the moment, I just want to make sure that you're familiar with these various controls. So we'll start off with vertical, and actually I'm going to start off by reducing the value for scale. Scale is effectively a zoom control, and I'm going to reduce the value so that we can see the outer edges of the image so that you'll get a better sense of the shape, if you will, for the various adjustments that we're applying, the transformations we're applying. We'll talk a little bit more about scale here shortly. We'll start off, though, with the vertical control. Now, notice that we do have that grid display, as we saw earlier, that overlays on the image when we mouse over or drag on any of these sliders so that we have a reference that can be very helpful, of course. And the idea of the vertical transformation, the vertical perspective correction, is we can effectively lean the image away from us or toward us. So think of this as though it were a printed photo that you're holding in your hands, and you could lean the top of the image away from you or the top of the image toward you, and that will change the effective angles that you're observing in the image. So I'm sort of leaning the image away or pulling it toward me. Notice as I start to increase the value that we start stretching out the image as well. So in general, you'll probably want to use a relatively modest setting for the slider here, just to correct, to get the buildings leaning to the correct amount, essentially, in the correct direction, as it were, away from you or toward you. If you start to take things too far, the image starts to get distorted. That's not to say that you might not want that effect in some cases, but more often than not, a relatively small adjustment is all you're going to need here. So right about there looks to be pretty good, I think. Next, we'll take a look at the horizontal slider, which is the exact same concept, just working in the opposite direction, so left to right. So if I drag over toward the right, you'll notice that effectively it's like the right side of the image is being pulled closer to me, the left side pushed further away. When I drag to the left, you'll see that it is in the opposite direction there. The left side starts to be pulled closer toward me. And so here, for example, I might want to bring the buildings over on the right, the Empire State Building, for example, make them appear to be pulled a little bit closer relative to the buildings on the left in order to balance things out just a little bit. And once again, if we take that adjustment relatively far, we start to stretch things out. So usually a relatively modest adjustment is all you're going to need here. Keep in mind that these adjustments, you might say, sort of interact with each other. And so as you adjust one, you might need to compensate another. And so you'll see here now the vertical adjustment having a bit of a more geometric effect on the image. And so I might need to fine-tune things just a little bit as I shift these various sliders back and forth. Then we have the rotate control, which is literally just rotating the image to make sure those buildings are perfectly vertical or that the horizon is perfectly horizontal. Keeping in mind, of course, you can see here we're eventually going to need to crop this image, and so you could also apply that rotation correction in the cropping stage of this workflow. And then aspect is an interesting one because, as we've seen, when we're adjusting these various controls, we're starting to stretch the image around a little bit, and that means we're making some of the objects taller or shorter, depending on the specific setting that we've used, and aspect allows us to essentially compensate for that. This requires, of course, that you have a sense of how tall and skinny versus short and squat the objects that appear in the frame should be. I'll increase the value for aspect, and you'll notice that the objects in the frame appear to be taller and skinnier, and as I use a negative value, they appear more short and squat. And so you need to try to keep in mind, what was the actual aspect ratio of the objects? How tall and skinny were these buildings, for example? but we can compensate for distortions of those relative heights, you might say, with this aspect slider. So that can be very helpful after we've applied, especially the vertical and horizontal corrections for transform. And then the scale option, obviously you've seen how we've really distorted the overall shape of this image. You look at the outer boundary and the rectangle is no longer a rectangle. It is essentially, well, not even a parallelogram at this point. And so we've distorted those edges. We're going to need to crop. Scale enables us conceptually to crop. The problem is that we're sort of cropping equally all the way around the image. And so I usually don't like to use scale for cropping to make sure that we don't have that white area around the edge of the image, but rather I like to pull that out. So generally using a relatively low value for scale so that I can see most of the edge. I don't necessarily need to see all corners of the image, for example, but enough of the image that I'll be able to exercise a little bit more control, cropping as a separate step. And then related to that are the X and Y offset controls. This literally just allows us to shift. So you can see the image at the moment is shifted more to the right of our frame here with more space over on the left. I can actually shift the image left and right to, for example, center it up a little bit better. So right about there looks to be more or less centered. I could adjust the Y offset to vertically shift the image as needed. And that's primarily going to be helpful for the scale control so that I don't have to increase quite as much. And so maybe right about there looks to be pretty good so that I'm still leaving some room for cropping after the fact. And speaking of cropping, we'll see this again in a moment, but we have a constrain crop control. This will effectively automatically crop the image to get rid of this white space that we have around the border. Generally, I prefer not to use that option and instead, once again, to use the crop tool in order to exercise a little bit more control over that crop. So we'll take a look at that crop a little bit later, but for the moment, I will turn on that constrain crop checkbox so that you can see the effect. So I'll turn that on and you can see that all that white space has now been cropped automatically. But again, in most cases, I would prefer to use the crop tool to exercise a little bit more control over that cropping. So let's assume that we've gotten that image pretty well straightened out. We're going to take a look now at some of the more automatic options for adjusting perspective. So here we have a rather extreme example, very low relative to the building here at the Trevi Fountain in Rome. And so we have, again, that perspective of the building leaning away from us. Note in this case that the image was not shot very well from the standpoint of correcting perspective because we haven't left very much space over on the sides, and so cropping may become problematic. But let's use this image as a way to evaluate some of the relatively automated ways we can correct for perspective. So again, in the transform section of the right panel in the develop module, we have the upright controls, which are a series of 6 buttons. The default is off, so we have no adjustment being applied. I'm going to start off with level, which really is just rotation. So this is attempting to straighten out the horizon, as it were, or make buildings vertical just by rotating the image a little bit. That's obviously a relatively modest correction in most cases, and certainly with this image. Then we have vertical, which combines level, so that horizon correction as it were, with vertical perspective correction. Here, a rather dramatic effect, obviously, where we're trying to straighten out, make vertical the lines of the building. You can see here the cropping, as I mentioned, will be rather problematic for this particular photo. And then we have full, which is adding horizontal. And so I'll click on full, and we get just a little bit of a shift for the image. So vertical with the leveling plus vertical perspective correction, and then full adds both vertical and horizontal. So we have level, vertical, and full equals level plus vertical plus horizontal, essentially. And so that gives us a pretty good effect overall for this image. And then there's also an auto option where essentially Lightroom Classic will evaluate the image and try to find just the right settings for this photo. So I'll click auto, and that gives us a very different result and a pretty good result, sort of balancing the effect of vertical without having to crop too much. So trying to get things sorted out where we've balanced those overall results as best as possible, at least in the context of an automatic adjustment. But we can also apply sort of a semi-automatic adjustment. An automatic adjustment where we get to give our input, essentially, and that is the guided edit option. And guided edit, in my mind, is one of the more powerful perspective correction options in Lightroom Classic because we get to choose which lines should be truly horizontal or vertical. Well, both, really. So let's take a look at another image and evaluate that guided edit option. I'll start off by selecting guided under those upright controls. Note that at the top left there's the circle where the guided control actually was. I'll click to turn that off, and you'll see that that gives us the little set of 4 lines here. At any time I can click to access that tool to make changes to my settings, for example, or click back in the circle to put the tool away, as it were. So I'll go ahead and select that guided edit tool. And the idea is that we're going to draw lines in the image representing areas of the image or lines within the image that should be perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. So let's go ahead and start with our first line. First off, you want to make sure, in my mind, that the Show Loop checkbox is turned on the toolbar down below the preview area so that you get this loop attached to the image so that you can see exactly where you're clicking and dragging. So you get a closer view within that loop view. And in general, I recommend that you draw your lines in guided edit as long as possible. You want to use as long a line so that you have a little bit more fine-tuning control. So I'm going to start off with the roof line. I assume this roof line should be perfectly horizontal. And so I'll start over at the far left edge of the roof, and using the loop view, I'll try to make sure that my crosshair is right on that roof line. I'll then click and hold the mouse and drag across. Notice that I now have this line extending. And if I make a very short line, then a small movement up and down creates a big movement of the line. Whereas if I make a longer line, now a small movement equals a small movement. So again, I recommend using as long a line as possible based on the image, and then once again referencing that loop view to make sure that I'm putting this line as close as possible to exactly on that roof line. And so now I can release the mouse and that line is added. Notice that I have these handles. I can always go back and fine-tune the position if I didn't get it quite right. But also notice that when I created this horizontal line on the roof line that should be perfectly horizontal, absolutely nothing happened. And that's because for guided edit to work, I need a minimum of 2 lines. And in this case, I'm going to make 2 horizontal lines. I'll start off at the bottom. So at the lower end of the building here, I'll go find a line. I think this concrete line will work out pretty well. And so click and drag over to the other side of the building and right about there. So this is my second line, and that enables, in this case, a horizontal correction. So when I release the mouse this time, we will see a change in the image. So I'll release, and now we have horizontal lines that are truly horizontal, and we've been able to select which lines those were. But we also, obviously, if we take a look at especially the left and right edges of the photo, we have vertical lines that are not truly vertical. So let's see if we can compensate for that. With guided edit, again, we need at least 2 lines, but we can use up to 4 lines. So generally that would, of course, mean 2 horizontal and 2 vertical. And I'll start off over near the left edge, and we'll find a line that I think should be vertical. And I'll click and drag downward and right about there, and that gives us our third correction. And so that seems to be a pretty good result over on the left side. But of course, the right side still has that leaning inward effect, essentially. And so I'll add my 4th line. Once again, just click and drag. And right about there looks to be a good position. Release the mouse, and now we have a much more significant correction for the image. So our horizontal lines are horizontal, our vertical lines are vertical, and we have a much improved look for the image. And obviously we've been looking at a variety of different types of images as we've explored the various lens corrections and perspective corrections, but you can probably appreciate that some of these perspective corrections are especially helpful and really especially important when it comes to architectural photography, to photography of buildings. And again, as I mentioned earlier, even though this guided edit does a remarkable job for especially architectural images, we can still apply additional corrections using the transform controls. So if you felt that the lines weren't quite perfect, we could still apply a bit of a correction. And especially, I would say, that aspect control, once again, can be especially helpful to try to make sure that the building, for example, looks as tall and skinny versus short and squat as it should. And also the scale control, so I can effectively zoom out a little bit so that I'm able to apply a crop with a little bit more control. And so speaking of that crop, let's take a look at the cropping of the image. We'll select a different image here, and I'll make sure, yes, I do have my lens corrections applied. I can then go into the transform controls and fine tune. So here I've shifted things around just a little bit. I think actually maybe we need to rotate just a little bit more counterclockwise and perhaps a little more horizontal perspective correction. That looks to be pretty good. And then I'll reduce the scale value. And of course, I could shift with my X and Y offset so that I'm able to fine tune where the image effectively appears so that that scale is a little bit more helpful. And perhaps something like that is a good starting point. But again, generally, when I'm applying all these various transformations, I want to apply the cropping with a bit more control, not just turning on the constrain crop checkbox, but actually going to the crop tool so that I can control where I'm cropping the image. Note, by the way, that we have a constrain to image checkbox here that will constrain the crop. That will help make sure that we don't accidentally leave a little bit of that white space, but we still have control over the crop itself. So I'm going to turn on that constrain to image checkbox, and now you'll see that all four corners of the cropping box here fall within the actual image area. So there's no white space actually appearing, but I can still adjust the crop. I can't take that crop outside of the image. So no matter how hard I drag my mouse upward here, I can't get the crop corner to go outside of the actual image area, but I can fine tune exactly where I'm positioning the crop. And so, for example, if I am trying to open up some more space here out toward the left, you'll notice that I run into a brick wall effectively because the bottom left corner is running up to the edge of the image. I'll exaggerate the effect here. I'm going to bring that corner upward, and then I can take the top corner further over. So just to illustrate that concept, that we're able to exercise greater control. So here, if I wanted more of the wheat in the foreground, I would need to bring that bottom left edge inward a little bit and also the bottom right edge in a little bit in order to be able to get down toward the bottom of the image. And so I do recommend in this type of scenario where we've applied these transformation corrections that you turn on the constrain to image checkbox within the crop tool, because that gives you then the assurance that you're not going to have any of that white space while still having the control of choosing how you're going to interpret the crop within the context of the actual image area. So this gives you more control over that crop without risking that you're going to have that accidental white space around the edges. And so I could certainly fine-tune the rotation. So again, we had that rotation control in our transformation adjustments, but I can also click and drag outside the crop box, or I could use the angle slider, or if I actually had a straight line, a straight horizon here, or a vertical building to reference, I could use that angle tool and then click and drag. So for example, let's assume I want the bottom of the roof line here to be perfectly horizontal. I can click and drag with that angle tool in order to make that area perfectly horizontal. In this case, I don't think the barn was perfectly aligned essentially in the first place. And so I think it looks a little bit better if I actually rotate a little bit counterclockwise. So something like that looks to be a little bit better. But again, having that control over the specific way that we're cropping the image after we've really kind of distorted the image, but distorted in a good way to compensate for those perspective issues, creating a very uneven edge around the overall image. Note, by the way, that as you're adjusting the crop, you might find it helpful to change among one of the various overlays that's available for the crop tool. So I'm going to go up to the menu bar here, and from the Tools menu, I'll choose Crop Guide Overlay, and you can see that there are a variety of options available. And there's also an option to just cycle through the grid overlay, and there's a shortcut key, the letter O on the keyboard for overlay. But you could choose an option here. So for example, maybe I would choose the grid option so that I have a little bit more detailed overlay, but I could also use that keyboard shortcut. So I'll press the letter O on the keyboard. Here's the rule of thirds option, for example, and here's diagonals, centering. And so we have a variety of those guide overlays for the crop tool that we can choose from. Again, either choosing from the menu or cycling through, pressing the letter O on the keyboard to find the option that you feel is most helpful as you're adjusting the overall crop for the image. So I'll go ahead and click Done to apply that crop. Well, as you can see, those lens corrections and perspective corrections really give you a lot of control over your photos and can help improve the overall look of your images. So thanks for joining me today, and be sure to check out timgrayphoto.com to learn more about me and my various projects.